All right. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And welcome to the session on conflicts over transportation. I'm Karen Brewster. I'm a research associate with the Oral History Program at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and your moderator for this morning's session. And I am have been a board member for the Alaska Historical Society for the last umpteen years. And so I'm happy to be here and looking forward to our presentations, all connected to the history of transportation in Alaska and sort of the conflicts between government and industry and the public and private sectors. And we'll see what we can learn. And like in other sessions, we'll have each presenter speak and have questions at the end for everybody. And please feel free to enter your questions in the chat or the ask a question option, which is down at the bottom of your screen below the speakers. And I will try and keep track of those and have people answer at the end. So to start with, well, our three speakers this morning are Mark Moore, Leanna Prax-Williams, and Phil White. And we're going to start with Mark, who is going to give us a presentation on LeTourneau's Overland Trains, and a book he's just finished about them. And Mark is from Gig Harbor, Washington. And we'll start with that. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and Cody for the slides. I appreciate it. All right, next. So how many of you have heard of the monster? Generally, you're going to have two prominent monsters in Alaska and the Yukon Territory history. Next. Yeah, that's not the monster we're talking about. There we go. The two monsters, the Alaska Freightline Snow Freighter and the Snow Train. Next. While we're just going to be talking about two of the monsters today, or two of the Overland Trains, there were actually six developed between 1952 and 1961. The first was called, simply put, the LeTourneau train. Next was a variant that looks very similar to the LeTourneau train called the VC-12 LeTourneau train. Next was a side dump train. The Alaska Freightline Snow Freighter and the Snow Train we're going to talk about. And then lastly, in 1961, LeTourneau developed the TC-497. Next, please. But we need to back up a little bit and understand a little bit more about history in Alaska at the time, prior to the Overland Trains development. Next, please. In 1943, Alfred Gezi, or Al Gezi, Bill Miller, and others started a freight company or a trucking company in Alaska called Alaska Freight Lines. It didn't last very long. It ended up dissolving in 1944. Then again, in 1949, Al Gezi started up with Alaska, a trucking pioneer named John Clark. Clark left Alaska Freight Lines in 1952 after he sold his share for $350,000. He and Al Gezi or Clark and Al Gezi were still in contact between 1952 and forward. Al Gezi was always trying to pitch Clark different ideas, as he called them, harebrained ideas for transportation and how he could possibly integrate back into Alaska Freight Lines. Next, please. On February 15th of 1954, President Eisenhower announced the creation of the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line. This was a series of radar stations that spanned from Alaska through Canada and over to Greenland. But there was a problem. The United States Army didn't understand or fully comprehend the logistics capabilities that were needed, which is why, next, the Army and Alaska Freight Lines teamed up together to help each other out. So going back to Al Ghezi and Alaska Freight Lines, Al Ghezi thought that he could solve the logistics problems to supply the DEW lines. So petroleum, oil and liquid, or lubricants, food, you name it, the DEW line stations needed it. So Al Ghezi created or proposed a make it or break it proposal of initial load of 500 tons to be a variety of materials. He competed against the United States Air Force for his contract and severely underbid the US Air Force by about 50 cents a ton. So now he needed a machine. Standard semi-tractor trailers wouldn't be able to haul on these roads that really just didn't exist. So he teamed up with the Army and RG LeTourneau Inc. to develop an overland freighter, but we didn't really know what that was going to look like yet. Next. This was a near final concept for the Alaska Freight Line snow freighter as we see it today. As you can see on the bottom right corner, RLL, or in January 1955, proposed this to Al Ghezi. And aside from the trailer rails, it was fairly complete. Next, please. As we see here, John Clark and Al Ghezi had visited RG LeTourneau's factory in February of 1955, looking at LeTourneau's different creations. I believe this is the VC-12 Tourner train or Tourner train. So he was looking at the tires, how he constructed, what he constructed the machines with. Next, please. Six weeks after discussing the Alaska Freight Line snow freighter concept, RG LeTourneau came up with this. He built this within 6 weeks, which is pretty impressive. As you can see, it's unpainted here at his factory. You can see the dome in the background. And then in February in 1955, later in the year, he shipped it to Alaska after it was painted, of course, to start providing freight to some of the DEW line stations. Next, please. But there was a problem. The snow freighter is huge. It was too tall, especially with those tires and axles on. Once the snow freighter arrived in Alaska, they had to cut off the axles and the wheels, and they replaced those axles and wheels with traditional semi-tractor and trailers and transported it over Thompson Pass in March of 1955. Next, please. So the snow freighter had three resupply operations. The first was to Bar 2, which is a DEW line station. And then the second journey was Bar 3. As you can see in this picture here, they used the rails or the sides of the snow freighter trailers to roll down barrels of POL or petroleum oil and lubricants. Next, please. Then in 1956, after a 2-month in 1956, the snow freighter was just leaving Eagle, and several hours into the journey, was going down a hill. Maybe some of you have heard this story. It was going down a hill at night, and a rather steep hill. The driver at the time was unfamiliar with how to operate the snow freighter, and it jackknifed. So when it jackknifed, it pinched the electrical wires that were going through, and with the 500-gallon diesel tank in the back, created a fire. Now, for all intents and purposes, the snow freighter was immobilized and a complete and total loss for Alaska Freight Lines. Next, please. So from 1956, the snow freighter had stayed in this valley There's a map on the left-hand side of your screen with Eagle as a reference. It stayed in this valley for a number of years until the Army decided to go in and retrieve the snow freighter. Next. Well, how are they going to do that? It didn't have engines that were viable. It didn't have generators that were viable. The other monster or snow train that we're going to be focusing on here in the next 10 minutes is the LCC-1 or snow train. Fortunately, the snow train was in maneuvers in Golconda, Alaska for Operation Willow Freeze. It was being tested with a variety of other equipment that the Army was trying to figure out if it could meet the logistics capabilities, trailers, different types of fuel transports. Next. And this is an article talking about the snow train going out on a rescue mission to retrieve the snow freighter. Next. On the bottom left of your screen, you should be able to see Golconda. It's a map from Google Maps here. So in order to prepare for the recovery mission for the snow freighter, the snow train had to travel from Golconda up through Talk, and then up in the middle-ish left part of your screen to Fort Greely for supplies and just to coordinate a few more resources and personnel. Once those were complete, the snow train traveled from Fort Greely through Talk, up through Chicken and Swede Dome. Excuse me. And it did pick up in Dawson City, John Gold, which is in this case, he was more of a guide. And they traveled up through the screen. I'm pointing at the screen like you can see my finger up there. Traveled from Swede Dome to Dawson City and then up to Chapman Lake. Next, please. Once the snow train arrived at the snow freighter in the valley, it had been there for several years. It was kind of a mess. The man that you see in this picture next to the wheel, his name is Marty Martinez, or Augustin Marty Martinez. He'll be in the story a few slides down. His wife emailed me when I started writing my book about 2 years ago and said, "Hey, my husband was involved in the snow train and the snow freighter. Would you like to meet him?" And I said, "Absolutely." I think in my book I put some other words in there, but absolutely. So Marty Martinez was actually the driver of the snow train at the time that it met with the snow freighter. And he was actually the one that cut the side of the snow freighter out because they needed to look at the engines and the generator and see what they were dealing with for a recovery. Next, please. Milk in the tires. One of the things he told me is that Marty Martinez told me is that because the snow freighter had been sitting for so long, none of the tires could retain any air. They had a large stock of powdered milk that they had brought with them from Fort Greely. One of the folks that was with Martinez in the Army decided to mix a bunch of that milk together and put it inside of the tires to act as a sealant. They never had trouble with those tires retaining air for the entire rest of the journey. So folks, if you're out there and you have powdered milk and you have a flat tire, maybe give it a shot. Next, please. So this photo is from Marty Martinez's personal slide collection. You can see the snow freighter on the left-hand side of your screen with all of its trailers, and then the snow train is in the rear. Now the snow train is not pushing the snow freighter, nor is the snow freighter pulling the snow train. The machine in the back is supplying electrical power to each of the individual wheel motors and propelling that entire train. Now, it went over really mucky terrain. It was very, very thick. We were in the thaw at this point. There are a lot of streams that they'd have to navigate through. It was pretty tough on the equipment. They eventually made it to Chapman Lake. Next, please. Now, when the snow train had originally gone up to Chapman Lake to retrieve the snow freighter, they still had ice and enough ice bridges that they could travel over the train fairly easily. But at this point, it had thawed out. So they had to make it back to Dawson. Instead of using traditional roads, the snow train and the snow freighter went through the Blackstone River. Now, the previous journey had been really tough on equipment, but going through a riverbed was extremely challenging. This picture here of the snow train, as you can see it, is where it's been immobilized because it had broke some of the gears or the driver inside of the wheel. At this point, the Army had coordinated with the folks on the recovery mission, and they had made it almost all the way to Dawson. And because of the time of year, they decided to go ahead and end the contract. The snow train and the snow freighter got out of the Blackstone Riverbed and continued to end their mission. Next, please. This picture here was taken by Les Millen. Now, at this point, the snow train had fulfilled its recovery mission, and the snow freighter was pretty close to Dawson at this point. They parked the snow train at the Dawson airport to wait a few months so that it could be recovered later down the line. Next. When the Army went and picked up the snow train, it went back to Fort Wainwright, and it sat for 2 to 3 years in this warehouse in various states of repair. Next. In 1964, it was eventually sold as surplus. This is the original surplus bid sheet that got a hold of from, was it the curator at the St. Louis Air Museum? I'm not quite sure how he got the documentation, but I was happy to make his acquaintance. Next, please. In 1964, Carl Pete Peterson bought the snow train from surplus and kept it in his yard. This is an overhead or an aerial photo of the snow train. It's in the top of the picture, and then one of its trailers is in the bottom middle left. And he had it in his junkyard until 2009. Next. So where did the snow freighter go? What happened to it? Next. When the snow freighter had been left outside of the Blackstone River, the current owners had towed it to Bear Creek Machine Shop, and it sat there for 1962 to 1968. The intent of bringing it to the machine shop was to hopefully conduct repairs on it, but the fire had pretty much destroyed the engines, the 2 engines that were there, and a lot of the electrical. Next. I worked with a LeTourneau historian, his name is Dale Hardy, and he was filling around on Google Maps one day, and he said, "Hey, look at this link." And I said, "Cool, let me go look." So the picture on the left is from approximately 1968 when the snow freighter was at the Bear Creek Machine Shop. The picture on the right is from Google Maps. You can see not a whole lot has changed there. A little bit greener. Maybe it had a new roof. Next, please. So in 1968, the Canadian government said, "Hey, you got to get this thing out of here or pay taxes on it." So a man named Bobby Miller out of Fairbanks bought the snow freighter. Now, the picture on the left is one of the trucks that was pulling the snow freighter from Bear Creek Machine Shop to Fairbanks. Picture on the right is the snow freighter being unloaded from a barge. Next, please. So once Bobby Miller was done with the snow freighter and selling some of the generators and other equipment on there, a man named Rick Winther bought the snow freighter at basic scrap cost for $2,000. He wanted to put it in Pioneer Park in Fairbanks. This is an outdoor museum of sorts. I'm not sure how many of you have been there, but I have not, but it looks pretty neat. When those plans fell through, when Rick's plans fell through, he didn't have any land to store the snow freighter, so he linked up with John Reeves, who he had worked with previously, to store the snow freighter. So you can actually see the snow freighter now on the Steese Highway at Gold Daughters. It's pretty stripped out, but essentially you're left with the frame and a little bit of sheet metal. Next. These are two of the trailers that that is down in Reese's property. They're surrounding this house, which is adjacent to Gold Daughters. I'm not sure if the trailers are still around the house or if they've been moved, but this was a picture taken by Mike Haskins. Makes a great doggy porch. Next. Marty Martinez. Remember, he was the man that was standing next to the tire, the snow freighter tire, when he went to go recover that? Well, this is Marty Martinez many years later on Reeves' property as he inspected the snow freighter. Quick little sidebar from that. Martinez went into the snow freighter and he found a wrench. And he tells me, he says, you know, I normally just don't take things, but I'm pretty sure that in the Army, Martinez had signed for that wrench. So he took it home with him, and I was able to see that when I went over to his house. Oh, and by the way, Martinez lives about 20 minutes away from my house here in Gig Harbor. So an amazing man, and listening to his stories, I could listen to those for hours. It's been a fantastic friendship developed over the last 2 years. Next, please. So let's go back to the snow train. So we all know that Carl P. Peterson bought the snow train in 1964 from Fort Wainwright as surplus. 2009, Pete passed away. So we've got a snow train in the yard. His son, I'm going to back up a little bit. Pete collected everything. That picture, that overhead aerial picture with the snow train in it, that was just one little piece of his yard. But I imagine if you needed a part, Pete probably had it in his yard for you. Next, please. So how do you sell a snow train? Well, eBay, of course. In 2010, Pete's son needed a way to get rid of the snow train. They put it on eBay for $15,000. Next, please. When the snow train was coming up for sale, Dale Hardy, the LeTourneau historian that I had spoken with, went into action. He knew two men, Keith Byram and Bill Graham. These are heavy hitters in the machinery and business world. And he coordinated to have and asked if these gentlemen would want to buy the snow train and keep it in from the scrapyard, essentially. Next, please. So they said, sure. Keith Byram is now the owner of the snow train, and the snow train is now on long-term loan at the Yukon Transportation Museum. It's being slowly resurrected. The wheels are not on the ground; they're on stilts that Byram had custom made. And from my understanding, with Jana at the Yukon Transportation Museum, they have one of the wheels left to mount onto the trailers, and we should have a fairly complete snow train. Next, please. So in February of 2020, we all know the pandemic hit, and everybody was forced to go home for work if you could. I had originally put up a land train website in 2011, and life got in the way. And then in 2020, I picked that up again because I had time. I commute up to Seattle for work. So I had a lot of time to do research and finish this project. Next, please. So in 2021, I went to Longview, Texas, and met up with Dale Hardy for the first time. This rack here is from the LeTourneau University Library, they hold a number of the original documents from back in the 50s and the 60s, and they were nice enough to gather this collection. So I sat in the library for many days, many long days, looking through materials, scanning, taking pictures, and I can't thank them enough because they're one of the primary resources for this research. Next, please. This is my first book. I work in cybersecurity, so one of the things that I didn't understand going into it was how much time this would take. When I was talking to Dale Hardy, the LeTourneau historian, I said, yeah, I'd probably want to publish in 6 months. We kind of chuckle about that from many a times because it took 2.5 years to write and research this book. But as you can see, I learned quite a bit about the whole process. The book is self-published and currently on Amazon. But one of the most important, probably the two most important things that I learned was the art of listening. How often do you really just listen to people without any sort of judgments or preconceived ideas or things rolling off in the side of your head? And then next, the power of building relationships. I spoke to many individuals that were in their 80s and 90s, that were in Greenland, that were in Alaska, and, well, frankly, drove these machines. So the power of building relationships, I'd say that's going to be your big takeaway here and one of the biggest things that I learned. Next, please. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. That's all, Cody.
Thanks, Mark. That was very interesting. New bit of big technology that many of us may not have known, or we've seen those rigs around and know what they were used for. So that's great. And we'll move on to Leanna Prax-Williams, whose presentation is Altering Course, Alaska's Aviation Industry and the 1938 Civil Aeronautics Act. And Leanna is an interdisciplinary PhD student at UAF's Arctic and Northern Studies Department. And her research has been centering on Alaska aviation and its depiction in mass media and popular culture. So welcome, Leanna. You are on mute at the moment, but she can't get off of mute. Cody. Oh, there she is. Nope, she's still on mute.
Yeah, Leanna, do you want to try refreshing the page? That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, while we wait for Leanna, she's going to talk to us about the Civil Aeronautics Act and the issues of the integration of industry and government regulations. And let's see. Okay. Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right.
All right. Go for it.
I am. All right. So my presentation today examines the impact of the 1938 Civil Aeronautics Act on Alaska. This law represented a major restructuring of government oversight of the growing air transportation industry and was the first major effort at federal regulation of aviation in Alaska. In my presentation today, I'm going to talk to you about how Alaska's aviation industry looked prior to the passage of the act, what it promised to do, why some pilots so vocally objected, and then also what are some of the lesser considered impacts of the law. And finally, I'll wrap up with some additional questions that this research project raises. All right, let's get underway. So why this topic? I'd read a little bit about the act in biographies of early pilots, many of whom did not seem particularly fond of the law or the bureaucracy it created. But why not? What did the law do? So in keeping with this year's conference theme of conflicting visions, I wanted to provide some context and explanation for why many of these pilots found themselves more at odds than usual with the federal government in the fall of 1939, which was a year after the law went into effect. So I structured my research around these three closely linked questions. How did the passage of the 1938 Civil Aeronautics Act impact Alaska? Why was there opposition from Alaska's pioneer pilots to these efforts to reform the industry? And whose vision won out and why? In order to understand why the act presented such a radical change for Alaska's pilots, we need to consider the state of the industry prior to 1938. So I'll start with a look at the lower 48 and then zoom in on Alaska. The 1920s and 30s were an exciting time for aviation as technology improved, airplanes became more powerful and reliable, records were set and then beaten. Lindbergh flew from New York to Paris. Public excitement about aviation and flying peaked during this time. Newspapers, radio, other mass media sought to capitalize on this excitement, whether good or bad. And airmail especially was growing in importance. Networks of beacons forming airways were being built to help planes navigate safely. Those routes increased from 2,000 miles to 23,000 miles in the years between the passage of the Kelly Act in the mid-1920s and then this 1938 Act. The New Deal's Works Progress Administration built airports across the country during the Depression, but Alaska didn't see any of that money. Then looking at Alaska, what was aviation like here? This period is called the golden age of aviation, both outside and in Alaska, but maybe for different reasons. It was something of a Wild West here, to use that cliche. The problems that characterized Alaska aviation during this time will sound familiar to you historians, and they reflected broader issues plaguing the territory. It was underdeveloped, largely because it was underfunded, and finally, broadly speaking, the industry was unsound. So first, underfunded. The territory, with its limited financial resources, had very few developed airfields that could serve anything approaching a larger aircraft. That was Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau, and Nome, and even they were not up to snuff, so to speak. Second, because of that lack of funding, the territory's aeronautical infrastructure was underdeveloped. Pilots at this time made do with whatever runways they could find. Pacific Alaska Airways, which was part of Pan Am, built their own weather and communication network because there wasn't a public system in place. Local governments or the territory funded what they could, but it just wasn't enough. And finally, operators here would undercut each other on prices just to get the business. The system of mail contracts were a hot mess, and they worked and they got the job done. But if the industry were to grow, there needed to be an overhaul. And Alaska's delegate to Congress, Tony Diamond, would argue for additional investment in aviation in Alaska, but he had limited results, in part because he was non-voting. So the territory knew that something needed to be done to get things under control. In 1937, they passed the Alaska Aeronautics Act, which created the Alaska Aeronautics and Communication Commission. And that was over the objection of many of Alaska's prominent aviation voices. But the pilots' reaction to this law proved to just be a dress rehearsal for the 1938 Civil Aeronautics Act. So FDR signed the Civil Aeronautics Act into law in June of 1938, and it reorganized existing administrative functions and created new ones, including the Civil Aeronautics Authority and the Civil Aeronautics Board. And that structure took some time to settle down, but was pretty much in place by 1940. And these agencies had broadened powers versus what was in place before. They ramped up construction of infrastructure across the country, like airports, navigational beacons, expanded the network of airways even further. The board had authority over safety and economic functions, and they aimed to support an industry that better served the public and had the potential for growth without that cutthroat competition. All right. One way that the board met these goals was by assigning routes and territories, issuing what were called certificates of public convenience and necessity. The act dictated that whoever had flown a particular route between April and August of 1938 would have grandfather rights over it. This, of course, presented some problems given in part like the seasonal nature of flying work, just as one example. Another issue that they had to untangle was to figure out what contracts were even in place so they could figure out what certificates could be granted or should be granted. A piece of mail might travel by steamship, by train, by plane, and by dog team or riverboat, depending on the season, to get to its destination. And those were all separate contracts, and some might be temporary or emergency or star route contracts, which were the most common. What was lacking was actual airmail contracts. Pacific Alaska Airways, that Pan Am affiliate, was held the only actual airmail contract at the time, and that was just from Juneau to Fairbanks with a stop in Whitehorse. So to figure out how to assign the routes, the CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, sent officials to Alaska in 1939 to hold hearings and gather information. These hearings are what is the focus of several different sections of some bush pilot memoirs and aviation histories, the most notable of which is Bob Reeves. Many of these popular histories discuss how the need to testify brought competitors together, even as they were hoping to secure the same contract. So why were the pilots upset? It would seem that for the first time, somebody was telling them what to do, and they felt like their efforts to that point had been kind of underappreciated. Bob Reed summed up his position by telling the CAB, if we pilots who made Alaska what it is today had waited until the outlying bush and mountain required airplane transportation by virtue of public convenience and necessity, this territory would be today just about nothing but a worthless wilderness. And there's a lot to unpack there, but overall it seems that, it just felt like his work wasn't getting the credit it needed. Overall, though, even amidst all this drama surrounding the hearings, many of the people writing about this time concede that even some pilots acknowledged that these changes were probably needed. So what was at the heart of that conflict? It seems like a kind of an existential rift over the need for regulation and oversight itself. Kind of an ongoing debate. Many pilots had raised the same objections to these new rules that they raised to the 1937 territorial level act. Essentially, they thought that the status quo was working well enough, and they thought that change would damage smaller operators. The federal government, on the other hand, was interested in stabilizing the industry and setting it up for growth through the work of the CAA and the CAB. But how did this law impact Alaska? And like all good historical questions, the answer is it's complicated. So why is that? World War II. So it's difficult to separate the CAA's influence from that of broader military spending in Alaska. What's clear is that this period, beginning with World War II, marked the shift from territorial and local level investment in aviation to federal investment. The CAA during wartime kept building up infrastructure, although the rationale became national defense. The CAA's development plans for Alaska began even before the outbreak of war. They installed radio navigation networks, weather observation reporting stations, and even air traffic control facilities during wartime. The CAA essentially became an important wartime agency for developing national defense. So here's some numbers to help quantify this impact during wartime. First bullet there, 1 million. Things got off to a slow start, at least in terms of airways constructions. This initial $1 million was to fund development of radio navigation beacons from Ketchikan to Nome. And this was in 1939. And that 1 million was much less than what they had initially requested to build that. Second bullet, 21 million. That's the amount that the CAA alone spent on airfield construction in Alaska. Keep in mind that 21 million might not seem like much, but multiply it by 20 to approximate today's dollars. So over 400 million for airfield construction under the DLAND program, Development of Landing Areas for National Defense. And we're not talking about something like building Anchorage International from scratch. In many cases, the fields were secondary or alternates, so not super fancy by any stretch of the imagination, although some were some major logistical challenges. Bullet 3, 700 people, the number of CAA personnel in the territory during wartime. So the war immediately and permanently increased the CAA's presence in Alaska, going from one inspector in the 1930s to over 700 personnel by 1943. And then the CAB came later and set up a regional office in 1944. So what did this wartime investment mean for Alaska's pilots? Well, there was more than enough work for them, even those pilots who had lost their routes under this new law. Bob Reed, for example, spent the war flying for MK Construction, who built CAA airfields, and then contracting for the CAA and the military. Many pilots had a hand, essentially, in building up this infrastructure that shaped Alaska aviation in the decades to come. So what did that development look like? One of the most significant areas of investment was building airways, which enabled navigation in bad weather. This was especially important in areas like the Aleutians, which shown here on this chart. And this increased emphasis on instrument navigation would improve flight safety. Airport construction, like I'd already mentioned. Throughout the war, numerous airfields were either constructed or expanded under these contracts. And they were civilian in name, but very military in nature, as they were ultimately used either for Lend-Lease or the broader war effort. Northway, Big Delta, Galena, Cordova, and Juneau and Nome were all built up to meet military specifications. Galena is shown here in the mid-50s on the left, so during the Cold War, and in 1999 on the upper right, as one example of the continued impact of this investment. The CAA also operated what was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program to help train up pilots for eventual military service. The University of Alaska, so UAF, was one of thousands of schools and institutions that participated in this program. Nationally, over 435,000 pilots were trained through this program. Undoubtedly, some of these pilots worked in Alaska during and after the wartime, although there's not a lot of information I was able to find. But one name that came up and might be familiar is Pearl Alaska Chamberlain. She's an Alaska pilot, shown here on the right. So women were trained under this program as well. Overall, though, my big takeaway is that many pilots complained about the regulations that dictated their mail routes and restructured their industry, but they all benefited from the airfield construction and the navigation network and airways that was built up because of this Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938. So maybe it's probably oversimplifying, but it seems like it broke down as CAA was good and the CAB was bad. Interestingly, during the war, the CAB reached a decision that Alaska did require some special classification because the conditions were so different from elsewhere in the country. So in that respect, the pilots kind of got their way and got some validation that their conditions were unique and it did merit special attention. Additionally, the CAB let a large number of pilots operate without these certificates of convenience and necessity during the war because they were contracting for the war effort. But then at the end of the war, the CAB tightened up control. So my conclusion is that pilots like Bob Reeve were maybe being myopic in their reactions to the act. It would change their life short term and they have to play by new rules. But the longer term benefits of the implementation of the Civil Aeronautics Act enabled the industry to grow beyond that golden age, albeit with some major growing pains. Those improvements not only would make flying safer, but more regularly scheduled and better able to serve that public convenience and necessity. And this really was a bit of a need to take the good with the bad situation. One perhaps initially unforeseen consequence of the act was the tendency toward consolidation of smaller operators into larger ones, like Northern Consolidated, seen here. That was one of the fears of some of the pilots, I guess. The CAA's mission, by contrast, took a farther seeing view. Build up the industry and it would have room to grow and better serve the public. The war, of course, sped up this process, and it's hard to say, by how much, but after looking at appropriations and budget figures for the CAA during the wartime, before, during, and after wartime, I would estimate that it was by well over a decade. But as for those conflicting visions for Alaska aviation, bush pilots are still around today, and they're still doing important work that really is pretty different from most flying elsewhere. And it's often these smaller operators with that do-it-yourself spirit, but subject to some oversight. The successor agency to the CAA, that's the FAA, carries on many of the same functions, and subsequent regulatory changes have continued to impact Alaska. So really, both visions continue. So where to go from here? I'd really like to continue my research on these 1939 hearings. Reading through the proceedings are pretty fascinating. And I also see a need for further research into the Alaska Aeronautics and Communication Commission, which was created in 1937, to see what its ongoing impact was. But then as a counterpoint, I think there's also a need for analysis of airline deregulation in Alaska much later on. But my biggest takeaway from this is that I hope to conduct additional in-depth research on the Postal Service and the impact of airmail in Alaska, as they were both important forces in developing the territory and the state. Here are just a few of the sources I looked at as I worked on this project. If anybody's interested in getting more of these sources or talking to me about any of them, this project more, my information is here on the screen, and I will drop that in the chat as well. And with that, I am concluding my presentation. If I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Right. Thanks, Leanna. That was fascinating. Interesting how one piece of legislation has all these ripple effects. It reminds me, the Native Claims Settlement Act, and rippled to the pipeline, which, and the haul road, which gets us into Phil's talk and into Anilka and all these things. And you don't really think about the implications of one little thing. So thanks for that. And now we'll move into Phil's talk on Whose Haul Road? How the Dalton Highway Became Public, 1968 to 2001, which explores the history of the Haul Road or Dalton Highway and how it went from a private road to a public road. And Phil is an assistant professor of history and Arctic and Northern Studies at UAF. And his research focuses on energy and environmental history, their infrastructure, mobility, and the effects of climate. So Phil, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. And hopefully you all can see this, this slide.
Yes, we can.
All right. Wonderful. Well, good morning. Good almost afternoon, folks. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. And just a quick note before I jump into this. The presentation that I'm giving today is based on research that I'm doing that's made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation, specifically our own Center for Safety, Equity, and Transportation, CSET, here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So without further ado, jump right into it. On March 5th, 1970, Secretary of the Interior Wally Hickel informed President Nixon of his intention to grant permits allowing construction of a haul road from the Yukon River to Prudhoe Bay. 2 weeks later, on March 20th, Hickel released an environmental assessment for this haul road, as required under the recently passed National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, or NEPA. So this was the first environmental assessment under NEPA. And so, this is the environmental impact statement for this massive project. I mean, it was really just focused on the haul road, but it was a grand total of 8 pages long. And I always chuckle about this because, as we'll talk about here in a moment, this ended up getting thrown out. And the final EIS for the entire Trans-Alaska Pipeline System project, which actually included the haul road, was 3,500 pages or 9 volumes. And that was just a couple years later. So you can see that this was a really formative episode in this early period of environmental review. So one of the things that this statement argued was that the environmental impact of the road was not as sweeping or as dire as many environmentalists were claiming. And there's this fascinating passage that I want to read from this. And so this 8-page EIS argued, quote, "It is erroneous to conceptually postulate that the road is the first step in opening the North," end quote. And so I find this to be fascinating because it's a window, it's an opportunity to question what has been the impact of the road, right? Did it really open up the North in the way that many folks were worried that it was going to? But to go back to 1970, only 6 days after Secretary of the Interior Hickel issued that environmental assessment, the Wilderness Society, Friends of the Earth, and the Environmental Defense Fund collectively filed suit against the Interior Department in Wilderness Society v. Hickel. It became the first major lawsuit under the newly passed National Environmental Policy Act. And the plaintiffs in this case were fortunate to have a receptive judge assigned to the case. This was Judge George L. Hart. He had experience with the Arctic during his time at an Air Force DuLine station. And, so he understood some of the issues with constructing infrastructures in the Arctic. And basically what happened is Judge Hart granted the environmentalist preliminary injunction and argued that the road and the pipeline were all one thing, and therefore you couldn't have an impact statement that was just required for the road. You needed one that was required for the entire pipeline. As students of Alaska history know, this injunction, as well as one that was approved just prior to this concerning the native claim settlement, effectively stalled the Trans-Alaska Pipeline project. And this left hundreds of pieces of equipment, which TAPS had spent millions of dollars to lease per month, stranded at 10 camps north of the Yukon River because there was no permanent road, there was no bridge across the Yukon River at this point. So this is just kind of my opening gambit to bring us into this situation, because this is part of the controversial and contested history of what would become known as the Dalton Highway, or what we here in Alaska more colloquially refer to as the Haul Road. There's a number of kind of pressing questions that I have with this research, and I should say that here is a copy of the Wilderness Society's newsletter shortly after they won that big court victory in the spring of 1970. And so a few of the larger questions that I'm thinking about for this project, again, what was the impact of the Dalton on opening Arctic Alaska, right? to what extent did the haul road, as what we might think of as a spine road or a corridor, spur secondary roads and transportation systems? And then a big part of this project is focused around equity, right? Who has a say in the management of the highway? Who has a say in terms of who is permitted to have access to the road, to its resources, right? Both natural resources in terms of subsistence resources, as well as mining. And then finally, when this road was first permitted, it was planned as a private industrial road. Even that name, Haul Road, actually evokes a kind of private industrialized status. But as we know today, it is now a public highway. So how did the Haul Road become public? And this presentation is really going to focus on the wider history of controversy surrounding the road and this final question: how did the Haul Road become public? So just a big picture argument to get us situated. I argue that access and lack of access have defined modern Alaska. Transportation routes and infrastructures have been key to developing Alaskan resources and sustaining Alaskans' ability to live a modern American way of life. And this access isn't simply in the form of transportation infrastructures, although that's a big part of it. It extends to class and privilege dynamics about who has the means to travel, how they travel, and where they can travel. And access battles often swirled around opening areas for a specific kind of users. At the same time, lack of access has helped to preserve large swaths of Alaska from modern development. Lack of access has been important not only for wilderness and wildlife preservation, but also for maintaining traditional lifeways and sovereignty of Alaskan Native peoples. One kind of smaller point that I'll make here, this isn't as large of a kind of historical argument. We often talk about the Haul Road as this kind of singular thing, and it tends to be managed as such today. But historically, the Haul Road was actually two discrete roads. The first road, about 90 kilometers in length, was between Livengood, north of Fairbanks, and the Yukon River. And this was constructed between August 1969 and July 1970. Informally, this was called the TAPS Road, and the Department of Highways actually designated this for a period of time the Yukon Highway. The second road, or this kind of second chapter of the highway, is the 577 kilometer long Haul Road from the Yukon River to Prudhoe Bay. And this was the one that was built between April and September 1974 and provided the essential access for the construction of the terrestrial Alaska pipeline. Just going back a little further here in the history, certainly the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay is what supercharged these transportation schemes. There was a desire for permanent transportation corridors in the far north for decades before this. But it's really the discovery of Prudhoe Bay that incentivized both private actors and the state of Alaska and the federal government to develop, these permanent transportation schemes. Certainly in this history, we can't not mention the Hickle Highway, this very famous fiasco where the state built its own winter road all the way to the North Slope. And, as part of this, the state created an ecological fiasco, right? They didn't build it up to proper standards. People lampoon this as the Hickle Canal or the Hickle Canoe Trail because of the way that they built it, and they just scraped away the permafrost and it all flooded. And this was precisely the kind of thing that oil companies were trying to avoid when they were moving forward with the largest private capital project in world history. And this actually attracted enormous opposition, both to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, and I would argue this was a formative experience in anti-road sentiment in Alaska in general. But we'll have to save the Hickle Highway for another time because it's a story that's worthy of its own presentation. But just going back to this larger question of transportation in the far north, this is a map I believe from 1968, and before the discovery of Prudhoe Bay, it was widely considered that a railroad was the best way to kind of open up the north. And this shows a route of this proposed extension to the Alaska Railroad that would go to two key natural resources. The first was the Ambler Mining District out of the Kobuk, and the second was up at Gubik. And this is where the Navy had found large quantities of natural gas in the 1940s and 1950s. And it was presumed that more would be found. And of course, more was found at Prudhoe Bay. Not quite at Gubik, but not that far away. So before the approval of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, because the Haul Road was blocked. And then we go through basically the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act needs to be passed in 1971. And then there's still environmental opposition. And it's not until November 1973 that Congress formally approves the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. And so in this time in between, there's all of this debate around transportation corridors, what should happen. And these were debates not only around how the oil should be moved to market, but how, what type of logistical infrastructure should exist in order to build the pipeline or in order to supply the oil fields. And so Governor William Egan at the time, he was a big proponent of this road, and he actually termed it an Arctic Wilderness Parkway. And he advertised it as this parkway where users would be subject to regulation for the protection of flora and fauna, similar to that imposed upon visitors to national parks, end quote. So I find that quite remarkable. But other folks were far more concerned about what this road would bring about. So this is a quote from Thomas M. Brown. He wrote a famous book in 1971 called Oil on Ice, Alaskan Wilderness at the Crossroads. He was a journalist, and he was very concerned about the state of Alaska, owning and maintaining this road. And I'll let you all, read this quote. But one of the things, a couple things that I draw attention to is the state's history of regulation and the fact that this road might just enable, the ripping up of the tundra by four-wheel drive and all-terrain vehicles, the fact that it might just be a scenic eyesore. And then finally, this note, and it will expose above-ground sections of the pipeline, to the threat of armor-piercing rifle bullets or other vandalism. No insubstantial threat to a state where most of the road signs have been enriddled to near illegibility. And I know all Alaskans can certainly appreciate that. Well, in some ways, Brown was prescient about that concern because the pipeline has been shot at probably hundreds of times, but most famously in 2001 when a large caliber bullet did pierce the pipeline. So Brown's criticism certainly seems prescient there. There were many other folks who were opposed to the construction of the road during these early periods as well. Perhaps one of the most salient groups was the Tanana Chiefs and Doyon, the newly formed Native Corporation for Interior Alaska. And in the summer of 1973, Doyon Limited actually came out with a statement saying that they opposed both the construction of the road and the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System because of the damage that it would bring to the people in interior Alaska. And Doyon had this quote, "Our people value the land much more than they value the small amount of money that will come from the oil revenues. Our lifestyle will not continue without protection of the land and subsistence of the people, and therefore we must oppose construction of the pipeline." I think this statement is also quite remarkable considering, more recent developments of Doyon as a major player in Alaska's oil industry. What ended up happening is that, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act was signed into law in November 1973. And what was remarkable about this is that it permitted the pipeline and it permitted the Haul Road, but there was no environmental impact assessment ever required for the construction of the pipeline. There was no EIS required for the Haul Road. Obviously, there was a giant one for the pipeline, but even that big one for the pipeline didn't consider environmental impacts of the Haul Road as a public highway. It was kind of an afterthought in that larger EIS. So a lot of folks argued that basically there was a kind of quiet collusion between a development-oriented state government and the federal government and Alaska in terms of bringing this about, and that the public was kept in the dark, right? There's no public hearings, no consultations, no local legislative or congressional debate around the haul road itself. And so as one author has argued, the haul road is an example of land use preceding land use planning. Development scheme before the impacts of development are studied or understood. And government officials at the time, recognized that this road may very well open up large swaths of Alaska. So in contrast to, Secretary Hickel's original 8-page EIS, one government official said, "I can see a major trunk road from Prospect Creek to Bettles, the Brooks Range, and Kobuk and Nome." And there was this fear that the trunk road system would inevitably give birth to quote, spaghetti network of capillary feeder and access roads. And this was a well-founded fear. This is all before construction began. But then in November 1973, we have the approval of this system. In early 1974, the Bureau of Land Management granted a right-of-way for the construction of the highway to the state of Alaska. Psychologically, the haul road proved devastating to environmentalists. Alaska had been split in two, and from their point of view, it could never be made whole again. With the new road, environmentalists anticipated the intrusion of trash, uncontrolled hunting, and rampant development north of the river, north of the Yukon River. Governor Jay Hammond famously said that the haul road would be, quote, 800 more miles of ditches for Alaskans to throw beer cans in. That was his view on it, but we'll talk about Hammond here in a moment. Fairbanks conservationist Ginny Wood called the pipeline and road, quote, a broad and pretentious scar across an empty and innocent land, end quote. Lots to unpack in there, but this certainly gives you the sentiment at the time. And so haul road construction officially began in April 1974. Trucks carried 31 million cubic yards of gravel and another 1 million cubic yards of rock to bring the 28-foot wide road to secondary state standards. It cost roughly $500,000 per mile and necessitated over 20 permanent bridges and 1,000 culverts. There were permits for everything, and it was also a kind of archaeological bonanza. They found mammoth tusks along the route, as well as numerous important artifacts from indigenous peoples, many of which are now here in the University of Alaska's Museum of the North. And the Alaska Department of Highways worked with Alaska, the consortium formed to build and operate the pipeline, on specifications for the highway. But the federal government did not have oversight when it came to the highway's location and construction standards. So, road plans, basically, even the state DOT didn't have the details that they were used to when it came to road construction. These were far less details than they were regularly have to build a road. And this is because Alaska, the private consortium behind the pipeline, was really building the road. So this creates all sorts of problem later on in that there were, even though the haul road was built to parallel the pipeline, there were often places where there were many miles between the two of those. So you'd have to have these long access roads to connect them. And this wasn't quite the kind of tight utility corridor that was envisioned, but a much broader system. So I should also note that the fault lines over the haul road access were drawn well before a drop of oil ever moved through the pipeline for which the road was built for. And the Alaska Conservation Society and other environmental organizations opposed the plan. So too did oil companies and Native Alaskans. They all wanted to keep the haul road closed to the public. And so this became a rare example where oil companies, environmentalists, and indigenous leaders were actually all in agreement, right? They wanted the road closed to the public. I'm a little short on time, so I'll jump ahead here and just say that the most famous advocate for keeping the road mostly closed was Alaska's Governor Jay Hammond. Hammond campaigned on healthy growth and ensuring Alaska's quality of life. He was an avowed conservationist. He explicitly rebuked the frontier worldview that had long characterized the position of state leaders. And, he was famously against building more roads all over the place. He said, quote, "Alaskans are no longer in full accord that roads should be built to tie us all together." He actually proposed abandoning the Haul Road after the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, and he wanted a railroad on top of the Haul Road, which he believed would better restrict access to northern Alaska. And Hammond argued that the Haul Road policy was really a debate about what to do with the northern half of the state. So obviously that railroad never came to pass, but Hammond did try to limit access and state funding for the Haul Road. And he argued that the road would have, quote, "profound effects on the future of our state. Once opened, the state would likely never be able to modify that access once again." So he understood that this was quite the tricky process. Basically, what happens is Alyeska constructs the road, gives it back to the state of Alaska in 1978, and then there is pressure from a lot of different parties to keep the road closed, and Hammond actually intended to do that. But what happens is and there was limited access. Basically, the public could drive as far as mile marker 211 year round throughout much of the 1980s. But then early in the 1990s, Wally Hickel actually becomes governor of Alaska again after a couple decades and after he was Secretary of the Interior. And it was his commissioner for the Department of Transportation, a gentleman by the name of Frank Turpin, who made a policy decision to open the northern portion of the highway to unrestricted public use. Native organizations and corporations, namely the Tanana Chiefs Conference and the North Slope Borough, sued to prevent the opening of the road. And although a judge initially found in favor of the Native organizations, the case moved to the Alaska Supreme Court as Turpin v. North Slope Borough. And ultimately, the court found in favor of the Hickel administration in opening the road to the public. And there's two key things that this hinged on. The first is that the court found that the federal right-of-way for the road, right, so this goes back to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, explicitly referred to the highway as a public road. A further issue is the fact that federal funds had been used to construct the bridge over the Yukon River, and these funds were not permitted for a private industrial road. So Jay Hammond's intent to limit the use of the Haul Road and access to Arctic Alaska had been soundly defeated by the courts. And I would argue this offers a prescient warning because because of the Ambler Road that is being proposed right now. And proponents say this is going to be a limited, closed private industrial road. Well, I would say we've heard that before in Alaska's history, and we can see, some of the circumstances, or we can see how that turned out. The last thing I'll say here is that the early so in January 1995, the Dalton Highway became a public road. Between 1995 and 2001, anyone could drive the road all the way to the Arctic Ocean. Then, following September 11th, the state closed the northernmost section of the road, preventing access to the Arctic Ocean. Officially, this was a security measure to protect the oil fields. Yet, since there were 800 miles of pipeline that experts knew were practically impossible to defend, critics recognized this move by the state more served to keep the oil fields away from public eyes and scrutiny. So, thus, by the early 21st century, the Haul Road was effectively cracked open and made public, except for this tiny sliver that permits the public to travel all the way through to the oil fields and the Arctic Ocean. So I have three manifold legacies of this. I won't go into all of them, but I'll just say that the road will almost certainly outlast the pipeline and the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. Long after the pipeline has been shut down and removed, the road will almost certainly still be there, inviting tourists, development schemes, secondary road corridors, and without fail, endless controversies over access. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. it's a lot of history in a short time to go over. So appreciate that. And it is interesting, the implications that it continues to have and what will happen in the future. So we have a few questions. We only have a little bit of time left, but one question in the chat that Sue Sheriff asked about how they get into the snow freighter, Mark answered that there is a metal ladder that was hung below the door that operators climbed up, because, yeah, I mean, those are pretty big machines for people to get into. I don't know if Mark is still, yeah, he's still with us. So in the Ask a Question, we have a question for Mark. That did LeTourneau's project have any influence on the all-terrain heavy transport now used in places like Antarctica and Siberia? And I see you answered, but maybe you could answer it verbally.
Yes. We didn't have any, I wasn't able to find any evidence of LeTourneau's Overland Trains or concepts used in Antarctica or Siberia. There was some mention of some later trailers called Thompson trailers that were rumored to be down in Antarctica. There was also a couple of military exercises, but in absence of internet speculation and others, I always wanted to make sure that I found data to support history, and was just unable to find that. So there's a few other pieces where 1999, there was a Canadian company that had contacted RG LeTourneau Inc. about building another overland train. And there was a couple of faxes that went back and forth, but they eventually decided to opt out.
How are those LeTourneau trains related to, you know, what is now used, you know, the big rolligons and things that are used in Prudhoe Bay and in those places?
For fuel transport within the wheels?
No, they're the big Tundra tires, and they're used similarly to transport equipment and things like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is any. And Phil, maybe you had some evidence here, but aside from just being tested by the Army and looking at different scenarios within glaciers and crevasses, Firestone had built those tires originally. They were 10 feet tall, 4 feet wide. Pretty impressive, yeah. So Bigfoot uses some of those tires for Bigfoot 5 and 6, I believe it is. But eventually, I think they decided the smaller, wider profile tires were better suited.
Okay, thanks. There's a question to Leanna and David Ramser that it seems like Alaska suffers from a higher rate of aviation accidents than other states, even considering the high per capita number of pilots and planes here. Are further modifications necessary to federal aviation laws to address that?
That's the million-dollar question, and I would say that laws are most effective when people follow them, and so perhaps it's a bigger issue of changing attitudes towards aviation safety and the culture of safety. I think a lot of times people look to the past and think that what people like Noel Wien and Frank Barr, Bob Reeve did in the 30s and the 40s is still SOPs today. But, you know, a lot of things have changed, and that was kind of the crux of my presentation. Colleen Mondor wrote a really interesting book about this. It's called The Map of My Dead Pilots, and she gets at a lot of this linkages between the past and present. There's a lot of mitigating circumstances. You know, a lot of recent accidents have to do with loss of operational control, or perhaps the pilot is very limited in terms of his experience, and maybe there's pressure from the operator, from the passengers to complete a flight when conditions are less than ideal. And, certainly that's going to be an ongoing tension in a commercial industry, but our laws needed to change. Maybe there's been a lot of progress, but I think people need to change their attitude towards safety is just as big of a issue.
Thanks. Here's a question for Phil, also from David Ramser, that some have advocated building a biking trail along the Dalton Highway or within the TAPS corridor. Do you think that's feasible or too expensive and too much security risk?
Yeah, great question, David. It's interesting. This goes all the way back to the late 1960s and 1970s, and many folks recognized that the construction of this road was probably going to happen, and they wanted to make sure that there was the preservation of access for non-motorized users. So, ensuring that access has been on the mind for a long time. And one thing that I didn't get to in my presentation is just as essential as the physical infrastructure itself is the kind of regulatory regime that surrounds it. So the fact that the Haul Road is this federal corridor has been really crucial for limiting, the environmental impact along that corridor. So what we've actually seen is that, the problems that have come when it has to do with the pipeline and security, it tends to, it's not from kind of recreational users, right? I guess you can talk about that Hunter in 2001. You can think about that as kind of recreational, but I think especially if we had infrastructures and corridors there for human-powered travel where it was not associated with hunting, I can't see any security concerns for that. And personally, I think along with the Alaska Long Trail, that could be a major tourist draw for our state, especially after the pipeline's not there. And a big question is, what are we going to do actually with the right of way for the pipeline itself? Because that could be some type of tourist or recreational opportunity.
Yeah, well, as you say, the regulatory issues on the Haul Road where, there's the 5-mile non-motorized corridor for access for hunting and other activities is unique to, that doesn't exist on other public highways in Alaska. So another question is for Mark. What was the significance of the Overland Trains to the development of Alaska's transportation and remote construction systems?
I was reading that question and I was trying to figure out a good answer for that one. When the Overland Trains were conceptualized and eventually used in Alaska for support of the DO line stations, they were really just a concept vehicle. The United States military wanted to test out these concepts, and at the same time, we were dealing with the Army's nuclear power program. They wanted to make these Overland Trains nuclear. At the time, we couldn't get the shielding and the weight down in order to make these a viable option. But I think what we're seeing in modern day transport is just better road development, more efficient road development so that we can use traditional equipment with tractor trailers, D8, D9 cats, so something along those lines. But I think that they helped move forward some of those transportation concepts, but not in a mainstream manner. Eventually, the Overland Trains were not utilized within the military system because the last one that was built, the TC-497, it was over 570 feet long. So imagine that, right? Imagine that having a breakdown. So if you've got one trailer with a breakdown, yeah, you could remove the trailer, but the vehicle's deadlined or non-operational at that point. So I think eventually transportation using traditional machinery was more viable.
Thanks. Another question for Leanna has to do with what do you anticipate for the role of drones?
Well, that is certainly outside of the scope of my current research. I think that's an interesting opportunity, and I think we're here in Alaska, we're going to be quite a ways behind what is kind of starting now in the lower 48 and elsewhere, where there's these pilot projects to deliver drones, but it's not something I've looked into a lot at this point. I think they have the most interesting applicability for remote sensing right now, and in terms of being a viable commercial delivery, you know, that's going to be something as time and technology continues to develop to see where that goes.
Okay, thanks. And another question for Phil, also from Ron, both of these was, will attitudes about the haul road change when this current generation passes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ron. And I would actually struggle to define, the opinion about the haul road from past generations and current generations. But what I would say is, we can already kind of see a change in the conversation. And I would point to the rise of the Northern Alaska Tour Company, right? Mm-hmm. This is actually, got its start by a group of high school students in Fairbanks, bringing folks north, and is now a major commercial player on the highway, bringing thousands of people north every year to see it. And it's actually helped transform the haul road from an industrial corridor into a major tourist attraction. And so that in and of itself, I think, is emblematic of the kind of cultural shifts that we're seeing. And I would suspect that there will be, and there has been, a significant change over time away from just kind of purely natural resource extraction to more varied economic models that lean heavily on tourism and on, honestly, respecting more subsistence uses to local populations.
And I know we're over time here, but we've got 2 more questions that I'd like to present and have our speakers answer to. If people need to leave, go ahead. The next session starts at 2, which is Explorers, Olympians, and Drinkers. But we'll just finish up here with these last 2 questions. This is for Phil from Russ Vanderloot. How do you think federal-state relationships will impact the future of the Dalton Highway and the proposed Ambler Road?
Well, Russ, I think you put your finger on it. I mean, this is really the defining issue, because the state and the federal government, have been contesting this space for decades, and they often have very different visions of how these corridors should be managed. Personally, I know there's a lot of concern around the Ambler Road. I don't see the funding coming through for that anytime soon, right? Alaska has a mega project mentality. We love to talk about these big projects, but show me the money. Show me where it's going to come from. And I do think that whether it's with the Dalton or the Ambler, it's not just about these infrastructures themselves. It's about the regulatory regimes, as you know very well. And moving forward, I think the state is going to increasingly try to kind of claw back some of that authority from the federal government. But I don't see the federal government willing to give up an inch. And if anything, over the past 20 or 30 years, we've seen the federal government be more assertive in terms of regulations for these corridors. So that's going to be the ongoing defining battle.
Okay. And a question from Bill Schneider that I'm not sure to whom it's addressed, maybe to Leanna and Phil, but can you speculate on the implications of connectivity comparing roads and airplanes in terms of settlement, privacy, and access?
Well, that's a big question. I think airplanes, have a higher barrier to entry and access in terms of training than a car or truck, a road-based vehicle. I think what we've seen historically is that communities without road access tend to have a different development pattern than those with road access. In terms of privacy, I'm not quite sure how to quantify that, so maybe I'll defer to Phil here.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to have a better crack at it than you, Leanna, but I'll offer some random observations, which is that the kind of internet revolution and the connectivity that we're seeing today is absolutely transforming questions of access, questions of settlement, right? So I think it puts Alaska on a map as a place that more people are willing to live as long as they can have connectivity to the outside world. One of my best friends up here works for a Silicon Valley startup, right? And he lives in the hills of Fairbanks, right? There's also ways in which this cuts in kind of unexpected directions. So talking with a wildlife biologist, Tom Paraguay, and his thesis is actually that we're seeing less environmental destruction in a lot of places because so many people are just staying home and are on the internet. They're not going out into the world, which has manifold consequences, right? But it's interesting to think about how connectivity can actually be keeping people inside. And then the final thing that I'd note here, just kind of thinking about this is, and maybe this is less of an issue in Alaska than it has been in the lower 48, but with social media and geotagging has been a really big issue for wilderness areas because folks go in, they take a beautiful photo, they geotag it, and then that opens up access for people to come behind it. So connectivity can also cut the other way in terms of, opening up these remote places that, beforehand only few people knew about and had access to, and then really putting them on the map in a way that increases environmental degradation.
Okay, well, I also would add a comment to that too, that, the transition of access from, dog teams to airplanes to roads has really been a basic of Alaska history and settlement, and, dog teams, people had a real connection to the place that they were going through, and then airplanes removed that because you're flying over it. And then, now roads kind of bring that back. But you say Alaska has a different relationship with roads. If you think about places like Norway, where they have roads to everything, they use their oil money to build infrastructure and build roads, and Alaska didn't do that. It does create a different pattern of settlement and connection to place. And the native communities who don't want the Ambler Road, that's a privacy and access issue for their cultural traditions and subsistence. So there definitely are implications. There was a question that I guess I missed, which has to do for Leanna about your research. Did you find that Alaskan pilots were supportive of political efforts in the 30s to secure the federal funding for the military airfields?
That's not something that really I focused on with this project. I think generally speaking, there were kind of two camps in terms of the pilot group or the aviation group. There were people like Joe Crossan, who was the chief pilot in the area for Pan Am, for Pacific Alaska Airways. And along with him was Harold Gillum, who were really supportive of changes and development, seeing the potential there. And then there were people like Bob Reeve and Hans Miro, and to an extent, even like Noel Ween, who were basically said that what the territory was doing was enough, and they didn't want to see changes. In terms of military airfields, I think the strongest voice that I heard as I was doing this research for development of airfields in general and military airfields specifically was Tony Diamond. And Alaska and Polar Regions collections have some really interesting papers about that touch on that subject. So he'd be my guy if I were talking about development of military airfields in Alaska.
Again for you, Leanne, and I don't know if it's something you can answer related to your research, but there are websites such as tundrapilot.com and others that seem to be continually cropping up advertising remote airfield assessments and accessibility. Based on is this something the FAA is attempting to regulate or monitor to ensure the accuracy and safety by these so-called quote experts? That's from Russ Vanderbeek.
That's a really good question, Russ, and I think I would have to ask somebody at the FAA if it is something that they're looking at. I know a lot of the charts and so on say recommend visual inspection prior to landing as a way to put the onus back on the pilot of ensuring that the airfield is adequate, but in terms of regulating, that's not something I've done research into at this point, but maybe someday.
Oops. Lots of research on aviation for you. Keeps you busy. Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for your great presentations and connections with all these different forms of transportation and transportation history. As said, they're very well researched and interesting. And I'll let everybody go get some lunch, take a break, and we'll see everybody back at 2 o'clock, hopefully.